The courtroom was silent, a heavy tension filling the air. A simple look around the room told you everything you needed to know. This was not just any trial. It was a trial where emotions ran high, where the stakes were not just legal, but deeply personal. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, and even the court stenographer seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. The judge was in his seat, the jury was ready, and the defendant, a black man who had endured more in his life than most could fathom, was about to face something no one could have predicted. It all began when the racist cop, Officer Daniels, took his place at the back of the courtroom. Daniels was known around town for his brutal, unjust treatment of anyone who didn't look like him. His reputation as a bigot and a bully was legendary, and the fact that he had been called to testify in this case only added fuel to the already blazing fire. The tension in the room seemed to simmer as the door swung open, and Officer Daniels walked in with a smug smile, wearing his uniform like a badge of honor. But little did Daniels know, this was not going to be another case where he could intimidate, belittle, or walk away with the upper hand. This time the tables were about to turn. The defendant, Marcus Jackson, had been through enough to know that the system was stacked against him. He had seen too many cases where people like him, black men, were convicted based on the color of their skin, their socioeconomic status, or the prejudices of those in power. But Marcus was different. He was not just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. His voice would be heard no matter what. The prosecutor, a woman named Kelly Roberts, had spent weeks building the case against Officer Daniels. The evidence was strong, and the stories from victims who had suffered at Daniels' hands were enough to fill an entire book. It was clear to anyone who paid attention that Daniels was no hero. But what Kelly didn't expect was the move that Marcus would make once he took the stand. As the trial continued, the air grew thicker. Officer Daniels sat in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he stared across the courtroom at Marcus. Marcus stood up and, without hesitation, made his way to the front of the room. He had spent years avoiding confrontation, never wanting to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him angry. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just going to take the insults and the hatred. This time, he was going to make a statement. The moment Marcus reached the witness stand, he paused and looked around the room. The eyes of everyone in the courtroom were upon him. Without saying a word, he slowly removed his cap, revealing his closely shaved head. The crowd was silent. Then, something remarkable happened. Marcus, without warning, grabbed the buzzer on the side of the witness stand. A moment later, the courtroom erupted as the officer on duty stepped forward with a pair of clippers in his hand. Daniels's face drained of color. Marcus, looking directly at the officer, issued a challenge, something no one had expected. He demanded that his head be shaved completely, right there in front of everyone. The reason behind it was not one of rebellion or anger. It was far deeper than that. What Marcus did next would shock the entire room and leave Officer Daniels frozen, speechless, as the truth about who was truly in charge in that courtroom came to light. The moment was charged with so much energy, it was as though time itself had stopped. But just as the officer reached forward with the clippers, a change came over the courtroom. The power dynamics shifted, and suddenly, it was Daniels, the man who had thought he was untouchable, who found himself vulnerable for the first time. He had no idea how to respond. The other officers, the jury, and even the judge all watched in awe as Marcus took his stand, not just in the court, but against the very system that had tried to break him. And just as the clippers began to buzz, Daniels's face turned white. He knew that what was happening was more than just a personal confrontation. It was a statement, a bold statement that said, "I am not your victim. I will not bow to the likes of you." The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as Marcus's hair fell to the ground, and the final blow was struck. The outcome of the trial was no longer just about the evidence. It was about power, perception, and the future of justice. And with every strand of hair that hit the floor, a larger question lingered in the air. Who would win in the battle between a man's dignity and the system that tried to strip it away? But what happened next would change everything. It was a moment of reckoning for Officer Daniels. And when he was forced to look into the eyes of the man he had wronged, he was about to face something he had never considered: his own guilt. The truth was about to come out, and Daniels would have to live with the consequences of his actions. For the first time in his career, he was no longer in control. And as the gavel came down and the courtroom waited for the next move, no one could have predicted the shocking twist that would unfold. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Marcus stood tall, his head now completely shaven. The courtroom was a strange mixture of disbelief and awe. No one expected this turn of events, not the prosecutor, not the judge, and certainly not Officer Daniels. Everyone knew that this trial was about more than just the crimes Daniels had allegedly committed. It had become a battle of will, a challenge to the very system that had allowed men like Daniels to flourish unchecked. Marcus had been through a lot in his life. Growing up in a neighborhood where the police were more of a threat than a protection, he had learned early that the world was not built for people who looked like him. He'd seen his friends and family torn apart by the very system that was supposed to uphold justice. But Marcus was different. He didn't give up no matter how hard life got. He had always pushed back, always fought for something better, something real. But this courtroom, this trial, it wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system, for every person who had ever been wronged by someone in power, for every black man who had been treated as less than human simply because of his skin color. The anger that burned inside him was deep, and it wasn't just a reaction to what had happened to him. It was a culmination of years of pain, of witnessing injustice, and of knowing that things had to change. And this trial, this moment, was his chance to take a stand. The prosecutor, Kelly Roberts, watched Marcus closely. She had been fighting for justice her entire career, but she had never seen a defendant like him. There was a fire in Marcus's eyes, a determination that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the case that mattered to him. It was the fight itself, the refusal to let the system grind him down. She had always believed in doing things the right way, following the rules, the legal procedures. But as she watched Marcus take control of his fate in that moment, she began to question what the right way really was. She glanced over at Officer Daniels, who was now sitting with his arms crossed, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and confusion. He had never expected to be challenged in this way. As a cop, Daniels had always been the one who issued orders, the one who controlled the situation. But in this moment, in this courtroom, he was no longer in charge. For the first time, he was forced to face the consequences of his actions. Daniels had always been a man who believed in his own righteousness. He had spent years patrolling the streets, his every action justified in his mind by his sense of superiority. His treatment of black men, in particular, had always been cruel, dismissive, and often violent. He thought he could get away with it because he always had. His badge, his uniform, gave him a sense of invincibility. But today, Marcus Jackson was taking that invincibility and shattering it before everyone in the room. As the minutes ticked by, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The clippers had stopped buzzing and the air felt heavy with anticipation. Marcus stood motionless, waiting for the next move. He had made his statement. His shaved head was not just a physical transformation, it was a symbol, a reclamation of power, a refusal to let Daniels or anyone like him strip away his dignity. But the real test was yet to come. Kelly stood up, taking a deep breath as she prepared to call the next witness. She knew the case was strong. Marcus had built his own defense with every word he spoke, every action he took. The evidence against Daniels was undeniable. But there was still something that gnawed at Kelly, a feeling that something deeper was at play. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something much bigger, something that went beyond the courtroom. The trial was no longer just about one officer's actions. It was about the very foundations of the justice system itself. In the back of the room, the tension was palpable. The jurors shifted in their seats, clearly unsettled by the dramatic turn of events. They had seen the evidence, heard the testimonies, but this was different. The racial dynamics at play, the deep-rooted history of abuse by those in power, all hung in the air like a thick fog. Could they really convict Officer Daniels, knowing the power structures that had kept men like him untouchable for so long? Could they deliver justice when the system itself was so deeply flawed? Meanwhile, Marcus kept his gaze fixed on Daniels. The officer was still frozen in his seat, his face betraying a mix of fear and defiance. He had underestimated Marcus, and now he was paying the price. But Marcus was not done. Not by a long shot. He had fought his whole life to be seen, to be heard, and now he had the power to make sure Daniels understood just how much damage his actions had caused. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I'm not here just for me. I'm here for every man, woman, and child who's ever had to deal with people like Officer Daniels. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than any of us. It's time to start holding people like him accountable." The courtroom fell silent again. Those words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Marcus looked around the room as if to remind everyone that this trial was about more than the evidence on the table. It was about the history of injustice, the systems that had failed people like him, and the chance to finally make things right. Kelly sat back down, her mind racing. She had spent years fighting for justice, but now, as she watched Marcus stand there, she realized that the battle was bigger than she had ever imagined. The law could only do so much. What Marcus was doing, what he had done already, was something that transcended the law. It was about making a statement, about sending a message to the world that things could not go on the way they had. Daniels looked like he wanted to speak, to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He had never been in this position before. He had always been the one to call the shots, to intimidate and control. But now, in front of everyone, his power had crumbled. He wasn't the officer in charge anymore. He was just a man caught in the web of his own actions, facing the truth of what he had done. And as the minutes stretched on, the tension in the room became unbearable. The next move, whatever it was, would change everything. Would justice be served, or would the system once again fail those it was meant to protect? Would Daniels walk away, his career and freedom intact, or would he finally face the consequences of his actions? The answer was still unclear, but one thing was certain. The fight was far from over,